And first on the agenda is Sina. 2 topics. Can you introduce the first?
Oh, 1, 2, 3. Can you hear me?
I hear you now.
Okay, sorry. Okay, so yeah, hi. Yeah, the first topic. I mean, the most topic is around the most are around the multi-site, but the first one is start from the approach that we wanted to take from between multi-zone groups, the AWS model, especially about symmetric replication or one-time replication. That I mean, there's a confusion right now between what is being implemented right now and how we want to move forward. So that's the most part that for example, when I wanted to implement the multi-zone group functionality, I was more confused, and the site PRs also make a significant change through this approach that was already been taken. So this is something that we can discuss it a little bit. So if we wanted to take both approach, or how do you want to take it? And the second one is about the metadata replication, that currently between zone groups, it just goes replicate everything about the bucket instance for all zone groups, which currently other zone groups doesn't really care. I mean, they're not interested in. So it's just cause a useless load, and also it causes races that also can be eliminated in the other way around. So I can probably take the metadata sync later after we discuss the first one, because if we discuss the first one, that might be get easier to discuss also. So yeah, I mean, the first one to just tackle a little bit. So the whole origin of the PR was about to let a bucket start from an incremental sync rather than a full incremental sync, full sync. So currently AWS doesn't let you replicate the existing objects. That is, so when you apply a policy, it starts from the uh, newly uploaded objects, and you can disable it, enable it at any time. But from RGW perspective, we always tries to make sure that both buckets are identical, which from the experience, I mean, at least from, for example, our experience from our users, from the public sector, we can say that not always 100% is the aim to have both buckets identical. Some wanted to use this replication as a data flow to just move the data somewhere else and then modify the object. And so they don't want that modification affect the source object. Uh, so I mean, from the current implementation, this is definitely against it. But from the changes that I've made to uh, the multi-zone group replication, that I believe it can be also that can be possible right now, because so the older approach was we logged everything because we wanted to make sure those are identical. But the new multi-zone group approach is checking on every object that whether there is an interest for the sync policy or not, and then start logging, and then that logs. So only those changes would be replicated. So it's gonna get more lightweighted and can be and also the policy can have multiple rules and then filters and stuff. So it can be really play with those filters and get more into that term rather than the full sync of identical between two objects or two buckets. Um, this is the whole idea of the problem. I mean, the question. You, maybe we can if you have any feedbacks on it, then we can probably discuss it a little bit.
Yeah, I left some comments on the PR yesterday, and I think I confused things by talking only about kind of the default data sync from one bucket to the same bucket on different zones in the zone group. So replication without bucket replication policy. It's that one that I think we need full sync for disaster recovery. And I just think that each bucket should eventually have the same contents on all of the zones that own that bucket. But bucket replication policy is kind of cross-bucket, and so there is no guarantee that the destination bucket gets everything from the source. In AWS, the bucket replication policy doesn't do a full sync, like you mentioned, and so yeah, I agree that just doing incremental is probably the right thing.
Right, and also I wanted to mention something here. So, so we have two approaches here. One is multi-zone behind the zone group, and one is between zone groups. So the main difference between multi-zone and multi-zone groups is around that you can have a bucket with the same name in multiple Ceph clusters. But when it comes to multiple zone groups, uh, you cannot own any data for that bucket name in two different zone groups. So that definitely probably comes to an idea of having disaster recovery scenarios for multi-zone, and then having any bucket replication between zone groups. Uh, Speaking of scale, probably disaster recovery scenarios for clusters of petabyte clusters is probably something not really. I mean, it's far to uh, imagine, because it's kind of like nobody would plan to have a disaster recovery scenario for a 10 petabyte cluster. But per bucket, it makes sense. So this multi-zone probably would be more interested for small scale clusters like 100 terabytes or something, and only maybe 2 or 3 zones. So maybe also we can take a look at, should we really still have this uh, mechanism for multi-zones uh, supported, or can we just rely on bucket replication? And then if anybody is interested in disaster recovery scenarios, those are probably small scale clusters, and they probably are containing 100 buckets or a fixed size buckets. So they can also enable bucket replication, but with a full sync mode rather than incremental. So they can again achieve the model, but without having multi-zone, but again relying on multi-zone group. That is also something I'm unsure about it.
So you're talking about if the scale is too big and you lose one zone, if you stand up another zone, it's just going to take forever to replicate everything back and may never catch up.
My point is probably nobody at the scale is interested to do so. I mean, if you own a 10 petabyte cluster, which probably, speaking of X millions of uh, dollars, are you going to invest another X million of dollars to replicate exactly the same? This is something, can we see a use case for that? I'm just questioning the need here. Is there any use case for that, or is it just for the small scale clusters that they just want a disaster recovery because, for example, it's for a private company, 2 users, X users. I mean, fixed size of cluster, they want a disaster recovery scenario. It's not for a public sector that can goes to up to X petabyte of storage, X amount of requests per second, and many other scaling theories.
Yeah, I think that's a good question, and I don't have a great sense of. I mean, there's replication within a Ceph cluster already. There's backup services that can do backups for specific parts of the namespace if you want. Um, so yeah, I'm not really clear on on the line between those things and the scales that customers want each. So
But
I don't
I
have a
think
good answer to that.
I think at least downstream we have customers who want full replication. As far as I know.
Yeah, I agree. Um, and because I'm fuzzy about the scale, I've just thought that multi-site replication should try to scale as far as possible. And I know that there's obstacles there, but I do get your point, Sina. But yeah, I mean, I think that if we do come up with a model that is flexible enough to handle multi-zone specifically for that DR case, with full support for cross-bucket replication, then I would hope that that gives enough flexibility to cover all of these.
I mean, the most part of this use cases go around this full sync versus incremental sync. Otherwise, other than that, multi-zone versus multi-zone group is about just having serving the same object name in different clusters or not. Maybe we can question that part that maybe somebody needs to have the same bucket name in his disaster recovery scenario. Then that would be a need, and that cannot be achieved via multi-zone group scenario because that is by definition you cannot own any data in another zone group. So then we need to still continue supporting multi-zone. But I still can question that whether if it's asynchronous replication and there is no uh, auto auto failover for that. So when the cluster is down, nothing would automatically fail over to other one. Then how does the bucket name would play a role if you need to still change your endpoints? Or maybe there are some load balancing. I don't know. I mean, it's a little bit tricky. I understand that, but so if you think that we need to still support this use case, then I guess still that would be fine because then we can still put a line between multi-zone and multi-zone group here and still move on because again, that's all about full sync and incremental sync and just different behaviors when the target is the bucket is the sync or stream or anything else is on different multi-zone on different zone group or not. If it's the same zone group, then we can assume that you should sync or stuff like that. So I mean, it's controllable through the source code.
Well,
Uh,
yeah, I wouldn't draw the line between cross-zone versus cross-zone group because bucket replication policy can target a bucket in the same zone group. I would just say that the default replication for DR should always full sync, but bucket replication policy should not. Does that make sense?
so you mean in the same zone group you cannot have bucket replication? It should always be zone replication. Is that correct?
No, I'm saying that I'm saying it's fine to add bucket replication policy to replicate stuff from one bucket to another that both live in the same region zone group, similar
Ah,
to same region replication in AWS, right?
I see. I guess that still perfectly makes sense and is doable. So yeah, I mean I see what where you're going and probably I made it unclear that by drawing a line. Yes, again, one zone group with multi-zones can still have bucket replication between different bucket names or with filters and anything else. That still should be doable. And I guess, yeah, that's right.
Yeah, but in terms of the flexibility we were talking about, if we want to support zone groups with only one zone in them, so without DR, then that zone would have to run sync against itself to process any of the bucket replication. And I know that you and Yehuda have both looked into that.
Uh, which part are you talking about? Because I'm a little bit confused about what you mean about the processing itself. Can you a little bit elaborate?
It's the same region replication uh, PR that I think you had something
Ah,
similar. Yeah,
about
yeah,
same region
yeah,
replication.
yeah.
I guess, yeah, right. So it's what I had in mind for same region replication is we still log the same way as we do as before, but the processing the logs would be different. So if the target for that policy for that pipe is my zone, then I would have just used different methods of copying object or just reading from the local rather than calling an HTTP call, HTTP request. But whether it's my zone or zone group, this is something that the pipe should explicitly say that which zone actually I should read or write to. Uh, which we currently our pipes are able to give us the source zone is explicitly by ID. So then that should be we can realize it from that. Is that what you were questioning, or
Yeah, sorry, I didn't completely follow that. I'm not sure what the pipes are doing there. My understanding is just that in order for in a cluster that only has two zones in a single zone group, for example, um, the per bucket or cross bucket replication only works like from zone A to zone B, and then maybe eventually replicates back to zone A in its new bucket. The problem is that if you only have one zone in the zone group, then nothing would be processing the BI log entries that are meant for the same zone. And so we would need to run a sync process if we wanted to do that local or zone local replication. Are we on the same page? I can't tell.
I guess I understand. I kind of follow what you are
I,
trying
I
to.
think you did try to enable logging even with a single zone in a zone group, right, Sina, in your PR?
Are we talking about that draft PR for SRR, same region
No,
replication?
no. What it's saying is if you have a single zone, currently we
Yeah.
don't run multi-site sync threads, right, within a zone group. Um, you need
Right.
multiple zones for syncing to work within a zone group. But I think in your PR, you tried, or at least I remember we discussed that if you have a single zone within a zone group, then we still need sync thread to run. And I think you were trying to
Yes.
add
So
support to that.
right. Right now, it depends on a constant boolean in the period configuration or zone configuration, which is depends on multi zones in a zone group. But what I've proposed in my PR is that it checks the sync pipe available on the zone group level, that whether there is anything that uh, might be logged. I mean, there's a function called may log bucket, and then based on that, it will enable the threads or not. So it depends on whether there is any pipe applied to the zone group level or not bucket level, because we have two levels of policies, one on the zone group, one per bucket. So that is the one that now being considered at the zone group level. So
Yes,
if
yes.
exactly, so if you don't have any policies applied on the zone group level, no sync threads would be running. But if you have any, then it would be start running. And then whether any object would be logged or not, it depends on the object and the bucket level replication policy.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. I think that kind of makes sense. I think I had a question about how we want to treat, availability zones versus basically batch replication versus live replication. I'm not sure what happens with AWS. I think it's all per bucket. Um, but I wanted to understand how would we want to treat zones within a zone group and cross zone groups. Do we want to maintain symmetry within the zone group and treat them as availability zones, and use them for disaster recovery? And if a customer wants to use cross zone group replication for live replication, or they could have or they could have both. They could have live and batch replication, depending on what buckets they want to completely replicate into cross zone group. So do we want to? So how do we want to treat zones within the zone group?
So I guess speaking of availability zone, it has a different meaning in AWS because
Yeah.
availability zones in AWS, they do symmetric replication, not asymmetric replication.
Right.
I'm sorry, synchronous replication, not asynchronous replication. So it's out of this multi-zone group discussion at all.
And these availability zones are within the same zone group, or they could, or
I
how
mean,
does
they are different data centers in
regions?
the
I mean.
same city. Yeah, so they're pretty different with a distance of 50 kilometers or something. They have availability zones that they do synchronous replication, not asynchronous.
Got it.
So exactly. So I guess that's not part of their design at all. Regarding batch replication between incremental, which I mean we have this definition here. This batch replication is a job. It's one-time job. You apply and then it replicate the existing and it's over. So again, if anything is missed or anything has failed to replicate, you need to again apply another job. It's not something that will be run forever that makes sure that these two are identical at all. So that this definition of symmetrical replication, I guess it's undefined for AWS at all. But I guess in our case, it still would be doable because difference between full sync and incremental syncs come from a sync status that defines should I continue incremental sync or full sync. Uh, who decide whether it's incremental sync or full sync? This is something that we either define it by the, I mean, this starts always with full sync and then goes to incremental sync, and then the admin can again bring it back to full sync in case of any disaster recovery scenarios, or continue on the incremental sync. So I guess nothing would break here, or am I missing something?
No, it's just that um, I think multi-site has always been about, at least for RGW, has always been about maintaining that consistency for buckets within a zone group. So we would be breaking that with this. Um, so yeah, I haven't looked at your PR, but I'm not completely sure.
I'm not sure if breaking would be the right phrase here, because still you can do full sync. So it
Yeah,
depends on just
you're
the
making
status.
that configurable. You mean?
Right. Right. So you can start incremental, and then if you need it to replicate the existing one, you just switch back to full sync and let the full sync run. And between zone groups, inside the zone group, again, based on the status or based on whatever that the bucket has started with. So if it starts with full sync, you again go on full sync and then switch to incremental. If you have this PR and the configuration is false, then you start with incremental and continue with incremental. And in case of a disaster recovery scenarios, within a zone group, again, for example, you want to sync back everything identical back to the old zone or the other zone, you again probably need to trigger a full sync uh, with bucket sync, with RGW admin stuff. I guess this is nothing that would be determined by coroutines or the sync threads that we currently have, or am I missing anything? Because I've never seen that sync threads would automatically switch from incremental to full sync.
Yeah, I mean I think it's all just controlled by the bucket sync status within data sync. Um, the switch between full to incremental and all of that. So
Right. Within data sync, like considering it as a state machine, there's no transition from incremental to full. But if Rados GW admin changes the state, then we'll recognize that and start over.
Yeah, exactly. That was my
yeah,
point. So we can, so nothing would break. It's just as usual, just configurable how you want
no,
to
I'm not
test.
talking about breaking the flow of things or anything. It's just that the idea that we wanted to have zones to be symmetric. I mean, I know with sync policy it already isn't symmetric anymore. But I think in light of a lot of things like bucket index instance cleanup and all of that, we did bring up discussions around having zones within the zone group to be symmetric. But yeah, I'm not completely sure.
This is something that probably again us back to the topic that Casey said that we should still let replication between two different buckets in the same zone group. I mean, so now this is definitely a confusion here, whether we should always have zones in a zone group symmetric, or we should let it happen. If you let it happen, then probably would be a mixture of uh, theories between in a zone group between multi-zones, because one is targeting another bucket with some filters that objects cannot always be identical, but in big picture we want them to treat multi-zones identical. So this probably would still cause a confusion between zones in a zone group, I guess.
Sorry, I don't follow. I understand what you mean with bucket replication policy having filters, but isn't that always from one bucket to a different bucket?
I guess you can still point to the same bucket name in a different zone, because it's just they're just configurable. There's no problem with that, because in a zone group you can have the same bucket name again in different zone, and then it can be replicated.
Sorry, I guess I'm asking more generally about Amazon. Do you know if they require bucket replication policy to have a different destination?
Uh, uh, no, because they support both SRR and CRR, which is same region replication and cross-region replication. But the only point is that it should always point to a different bucket name. It cannot be the same bucket name, even same region replication.
Right, that's what I was asking.
Yeah.
So yeah, I mean, I think what I would like is for buckets to always have the right contents, and then bucket replication policy is always between buckets.
Right, but then just imagine that you have one zone group, two zones behind, and then you have a policy that says bucket A replicate to bucket B. But from the overall concept of multi-zones in a zone group, that we want to treat them identical symmetric replication, bucket A cannot be always be bucket A in other zone, because it was never the interest of that sync pipe, or bucket B in the other zone to be exactly bucket B. Bucket A would be equals to bucket B. So I mean identical. So the question is identical from which point of view? The whole zone, or based on the pipes no matter what? If it's based on the pipes no matter what, then probably it would be more like zone groups. Why should we name it symmetric replication?
I don't think that we should support pipes that break the symmetry within a zone group.
What is the current behavior? I mean, this is an existing feature.
Yes,
I mean,
that is the current feature.
so what is the current behavior with the existing code when it comes to replication policies? Do we allow like full zone replication, symmetrical, and policies that can contradict this at the same for the same zone group?
Yeah, in sync policies, you can at least in sync policies you can configure. We could kind of like add tags and prefixes to select what objects you want to replicate, so that the buckets can be inconsistent within the same zone group.
But what if like there's also like the general replication with the so the policies override the global? Okay.
Yes.
Yeah, and Yehuda's goal was to make things kind of like infinitely flexible, so anything goes if you can describe it, and that has been problematic in actually finishing multi-site. The latest example is around bucket deletion when we don't know what zones have what data.
Is it possible to make that like mutually exclusive, or do we have too many users that have this combination?
I'm not sure about upstream, but at least downstream, I think there is some interest in adoption.
No, adoption is one thing. Adoption is not a problem. The problem is, like, do we have, I mean, this is an upstream meeting, so let's talk about upstream. Do we have upstream users that combine both sync policies and global zone syncing in the same zone group? And I don't know, like the combined.
Sure. Actually, I'm not sure if we have upstream users.
Maybe the best way forward is to have those setups mutually exclusive. So if somebody wants global syncing, it's one thing. If somebody wants to have fine-grained syncing, then they cannot have global syncing. I mean, that's going to be a breaking change, but if nobody is using this like that, then maybe that's going to simplify without creating less flexibility for anyone that wants the fine-grained syncing.
Well, I don't know if it helps to make them mutually exclusive if we can't implement the asymmetric one. I mean, I'm leaning towards just deprecating most of the existing sync policy stuff that allows you to do asymmetry within a zone group and build something new at the zone group level to control cross-region replication or the bucket replication as a whole.
So if we just have like per bucket sync policies, why is this creating a problem? I mean, this is not a feature that we invented, right? It exists.
Well, it's a feature from Amazon that we mapped to RGW, which has kind of a different foundation. But I mean, I don't see this bucket replication policy as an issue because it I think is always about from one source bucket to a different bucket. So it's okay if those buckets have different contents. So, I mean, what I'm picturing is that we just have some way to configure at the zone group level which zone groups can sync from which other ones using the cross zone group replication from bucket replication policy. And within a zone group, if you want all of those buckets to be replicated for disaster recovery, then you put more than one zone in that zone group. And that's the number of replicas that you get for everything there.
Sorry, I didn't follow that. Could you repeat?
Right, so we have some system, maybe it's like the existing sync policy commands to configure which zone groups will sync from which other zone groups. And that's just for bucket replication policy. And within a zone group, everything is symmetric. So if you don't want disaster recovery, then you just put one zone. If you want DR, then you create more zones.
Yeah, that kind of makes sense.
I mean, isn't the policy command per bucket? Isn't it like a bucket operation?
So there's the S3 API has a put bucket replication where you attach a policy to a specific bucket, yes. And then my understanding is that the Ceph admin has to set up sync policy pipes or whatever to enable that.
You allow the whole replication, and then it started to enable per bucket. So the point is there are two phases in our sync pipes right now. There's one flow, one pipe. The flow is the one that would allow you or enable you eventually that from which zone to which zone you can replicate, which is either symmetric or bidirectional. And then the pipe is the one that defines which filters, which destination bucket is the one that is being targeted or the source that is being interested. So from between zone groups perspective, you need to first allow this flow that from zone A in zone group A, you can replicate to zone group B, zone B in zone group, for example, B. And then the pipe would be defining where to go. So put bucket API, put bucket replication API currently just only create the pipe because the flow inherited from the zone group level and then be constructed in the end.
Okay, so put bucket replication itself creates the pipe. The admin doesn't have to do anything per bucket.
Right.
Okay, that helps. Thanks. So yeah, I mean, I think whatever configuration we do, we want to allow admins control both per zone group, talking to other zone groups, and then maybe per bucket also to limit which, to restrict what defaults are set at the zone group level.
Yeah, not sure why would an admin need to do something per bucket?
I think that's one of the requirements that was mentioned downstream, customers wanting specific buckets, or preventing specific data from replicating to specific regions for legal reasons, I guess.
I mean, that kind of beats the purpose of I mean, if you need to do something like that per bucket, then there's this configuration scalability issue here. I'm not going to argue requirements from downstream, but usually I would say what makes sense is to have the admin configure something at the zone group or realm level, and then bucket policies should be per bucket only, handled by the bucket owner.
I mean, I agree. Like at the zone group level, you should set the default behavior. But if there is a requirement that admins have more granular control, then I think it makes sense to have commands that can override that. But I think that's kind of a minor point. We can talk about it.
Yeah, I mean, override is fine, but if every bucket operation need to go through an admin, then this could be a configuration scalability issue.
Yeah,
right?
I definitely agree. I don't think that I want bucket replication policy to work by default, but for deployments that don't want that, then offering more control.
And just to kind of recap, Casey, sorry, what you originally suggested, you're saying that the replication policy should be kept for between zone groups, and we should kind of deprecate that from within the zone group?
No, I want bucket replication policy to work essentially globally. You can, any bucket can have a replication policy to any other bucket. That I think should be our default behavior as long as we can make it scale reasonably. The part that I want to disable is sync policy that says zone A can't sync stuff from zone B, even though they're in the same zone group. When you have things like that, then all of the buckets in zone A have different contents than the buckets in zone B.
Okay, and why is there a desire to limit? I mean, if you put multiple zones inside the same zone group, isn't that exactly the meaning of you want them to have the same content?
Before Yehuda designed the sync policy stuff, yes. But he made it way more flexible, partly in support of bucket replication policy, but I think it would have been better done at the zone group level instead of sync policy at the zone level.
I don't think there is any replication policy at zone level. It's either at the zone group level or at the bucket level. That could never happen, I guess.
Sorry, I mean there's sync policy like Rados GW admin sync policy commands, and then there's bucket replication policy as the per bucket thing. Are we confusing those, or did I not understand you?
So within sync policy commands, Sina, you can set the flow from one zone to be directional, right? From one zone to another within the zone group. And also you could limit the number of, and you could also control if you want to replicate a bucket to a certain zone at all or not. So those are the things that it's talking about, which actually was implemented as part of sync policy, and before that it was always symmetric.
But these are only admin commands, right? They're not related to the API.
Yeah, the
the
sync
rest-
policies are are
Okay.
admin commands.
Right, I made a mistake. Sorry for that. It's per zone, but not per zone group. That's the whole point, right?
But I guess then if those are admin commands, then probably going to be easier to deprecate them, because I mean, somebody needs to go and call these commands. They're not like there's a whole bunch of application code out there using them. and they're not part of the AWS API.
I guess there might be a confusion here because the output bucket replication API actually create those sync pipes underneath. So this RGW admin commands would just help the admin to modify what the user has been submitted. So it's kind of like a helpful kind of thing that help the admin to modify what the user has been requested. Sometimes you need to disable that or whatsoever. But the point is, as long as you provide, for example, the bucket argument to be applied to the bucket instance of the bucket, then it's bucket's interest, not the zone interest. And the zone interest is just a matter of that the admin can only specify that, which you specify overally which zones can be replicated to each other, or is it by default enable, you want the whole zone to be replicated to another zone, or you just wanted to allow the replication overally, but again, per bucket to be decided.
So I think this is exactly the point. So having admin commands to override and fix issues done at the bucket level makes sense. It's like, somebody made small configuration and you want the admin to fix it. But adding admin commands that controls the zone groups or the zone syncing within the zone group, which is the existing way of thing that has nothing to do with per bucket syncing. I think this is where the problem is.
Right. This mostly, in my opinion, would be translated to the disaster recovery scenario. That you have a cluster, you wanted to have a disaster recovery scenario for another cluster, and you just wanted to replicate everything. They don't want to go through per bucket configuration or something. This is something that also was a part of the question.
But this is what we had to begin with, right? You replicate everything.
I don't get that. What do you mean
So
by?
I mean, if you forget about the per bucket syncing, right? If you have two zones inside the zone group, then you replicate everything, right?
If you wanted to, but again, the point that Casey said that Yehuda created this flexibility that you can still have
Right.
only
But why
replicate.
would you need that? Why would you want that? What's the
That
use case?
was also exactly my question from the beginning. That where do we see the use case of this? Is it something at a scale that we see that we need to support it, or we can just only rely on bucket replication and let everyone play with bucket replication, that zone replication?
I would say we started from zone replication inside zone group. This is happening for all zones, right? This is the initial feature. So this is what people wanted, and this is what we started with. Okay, so this is probably needed. Now, on top of that, if we want to have fine-grained bucket syncing, this is another thing. But why do we tie that together with something that also breaks the initial feature, which has nothing to do with bucket syncing or anything?
Yeah. I think we're pretty much on the same page about this part. So in the interest of time, there's still the topic about metadata sync. So maybe we move on to that. For these changes to sync policy, we do need to write up at least an outline of a design and build on that so that we can make progress here. But I can start on that offline and maybe share something next week or a draft on Slack in the meantime.
Yeah, that would be great. Though. We highly appreciate it.
So on metadata sync, Sina, I see your point, but I worry about failover there. You could potentially have the metadata master zone go down and want to promote some zone in a different zone group to the new master, and they would need all of that metadata in order to serve replication to the other zones. Does that make sense?
I mean, even though if you move your master zone group to another zone group, you as a master again you are not interested in remote buckets metadatas, or what do we call it, bucket instance properties. So even though if you change it, what could break? Do you have anything in mind, example? Because again,
Yeah.
interested in those remote buckets.
Okay, so you have two zone groups with two zones each. I mean, so if you want to create a bucket, you pick one of the zones in your zone group to create it on, and it happens there, but the other zone in that zone group eventually needs to replicate that new bucket from the metadata master zone. It's not replicating from any other zone but that. So all new metadata, all metadata writes have to go through the metadata master in order to replicate properly.
I guess we still can keep one master zone group for metadata, but the point was, so when you forward the request to the master and it's being logged as a metadata log, you as a zone might be either in the same zone group of the as the bucket exists resist, or you might be in a different zone group that bucket doesn't resist. The point is, when you want to process that log, you check the zone group of the bucket, that whether it's matched my zone group, then I will proceed. If not, then I just create a, a bucket instance that just have the zone group field, and that's it. Or maybe we can extend the bucket entry point to the specify the zone group. Other than that, you're not interested in any other properties of the bucket if the zone group is not matched to your zone group.
I mean, how much does that really save storing just the zone group versus storing the whole zone group metadata? I don't think they're that big.
What currently I'm personally suffer from is the inconsistency that it causes when the user just start create, delete. And also from the real example, there's, for example, I have now a user that just try to constantly write set bucket versioning. And this just causes a race on other Zoom groups that just try to replicate that, which they are not interested in. And then it's just an useless processing. So if I scale this misbehavior of the user to X bucket, X Zoom group, then I fear that this might cause problems. And also the inconsistency is just the most thing that, I mean, really bothers, because the users just, I don't know, tools, I mean, it's not a human, but tools just sometimes just create, delete, or create multiple times. For example, they issued 100 create buckets at the same time. And then that would start to replicate again to the same Zoom group that has already been created. This just all cause undefined behaviors, I believe.
So I mean, the place where I think this shows up is when a secondary zone gets a request like create bucket and forwards it to the master and also writes it locally, and then metadata sync from the master races with that and might introduce a change in between.
Right.
Is that what you're talking about with the inconsistency?
Exactly, yeah.
I mean, maybe it would make sense then for forwarded requests to log in the MD log which source zone it initiated from and avoid processing that entry on that specific zone.
Yeah, correct. That's exactly, for example, it would be the same exact solution that I use for data replication, that I have a log zones field for the entries that shows which zones should proceed. Here we can probably say which zones shouldn't. But I mean, generally seeing that, I still see that why should we still replicate things that Zoom groups are not interested in? Why just not we stop it at the beginning and then, maybe clear the problem rather than solve it in some other ways.
Well, I mean, if I'm not sure how failover would work if every zone doesn't have a copy of all of the metadata that it would need to serve on failover. But maybe we can follow up on this in Slack.
Oh, okay, sure. I mean, but just a quick note that because still those remote buckets, no matter what zone group you are not interested in anything else. So that bucket instance are only interested in one zone group that has multiple zones in it, and then the zones that are in the same zone group would replicate the thing, the instance or whatever it is. So they have the copy of the buckets that exist in the same zone group, but just another zone group doesn't copy because it's not interested. And even when you fail over, you're not losing anything else because that bucket exists on another zone group which has the whole thing, and nowhere else that this metadata needs to be synced. I mean,
but what if you add a new zone group, or sorry, a new zone to the zone group that has this bucket? It would have to do a metadata full sync from the metadata master to find out about that bucket.
Right. So yeah, okay. Now that's the problem. Yeah, it should ask the zone that is in the same zone group, so this doesn't work, right? So maybe I need to think it over. I mean, that was also the thing that why should we solve this case? But okay, right.
Yeah. Right. There's a lot to metadata sync that I don't think is completely obvious, and I don't think we have a perfect model for failover, but I do want to make sure that it still is reasonably sensible.
Right.
I know that there have been separate discussions about finding ways to move away from the single metadata master model with something like consensus, but I think that raises some complications too. But all right, I think we're running out of time. Any final points on this before we call it?
Just a quick question about my PR for bucket index cleanup. So I know that there's been discussion about on the PR about zone groups and indexless buckets. But currently, currently we're really looking only in the zone group and checking for zones that if they have. We are actually looking at the sync status from the other zones, and then we're really setting the thing in the trimming logic. So we're not really looking in other zone groups. So do we want to just take it as it is right now and then add all the other zone group related things later, or how do we want to treat that PR right now?
I guess because it's completely different direction from what I implemented there. If we proceed with yours and merge it, then I need to just rework it because it's part of my proposal. So we just don't need to block yours if
Right.
you are on
Yeah.
the faster path than my PR. So yeah.
I mean,
But-
at least it works within the same zone group. So any other
Right.
improvements you want to make, you can make it on top of it.
Yeah, that's part of the proposal, so no worries. I just have that confusion. Yeah, go on.
Sorry, are you talking mostly about your proposal to use indexless buckets outside of the zone group? Because
Right.
I think that could work independently. I don't see a conflict there. I think the key should be that Trim needs to delete the bucket instance metadata, and that should also delete the bucket index objects as long as the bucket isn't indexless. And I think the deletion of the bucket index is currently missing, unless I'm misunderstanding it.
Sorry, what's missing?
The code to delete bucket index objects.
It does delete. I mean, we do delete bucket index objects as part of trimming logic right now. I mean, we have an asynchronous call there.
Oh, okay, right. So it's right.
Yeah,
It's
we do.
doing the purge thing
Right.
before
Right.
it
Within,
deletes the bucket metadata. That makes
yeah,
sense.
I saw your update. I saw your comment about the instance metadata remove handler, but that would have been only a non-asynchronous call. But here we need an asynchronous call within the trim logic. Yes, and we do that. So I don't see any issues with cleaning up the indexes there.
Okay, you're right. Thanks for clearing that up.
Yeah, just a final quick question that I just a little bit confused. Why do we need to keep the indexes after all? I mean, because as you said, it's just about the sync status. So what those indexes would benefit us by keeping them if the syncing bucket is true here?
So the problem is, say you have two zones with some objects in the bucket, and the one zone deletes all the objects and then deletes the bucket. The second zone needs to be able to do data sync to replicate all of the deletions that happened on the first so that it gets rid of the data before it can do its cleanup. So if
I
the
see.
first zone deletes the bucket index and the BI log entries that the second zone needs, then it wouldn't be able to finish that cleanup.
Yeah, right. I handled this case in the zone group case by checking if the bucket was deleted, then return a non-applicable sync status. But yeah, I mean, okay, then we can discuss this. Again, this is another proposal, so it doesn't need to block your PR. You can go on and then we discuss it on my PR. Okay, all right, thank you.
Yeah. Any improvements we could discuss through a different PR. Yes, I'm okay with that. Okay, yeah, that's all I have. Thanks.
All right, thanks very much, everybody. See you next time.